The gunshot echoed through the dusty main street of Snake River, Wyoming, silencing the crowd that had gathered for the annual shooting competition. Violet Evans flinched at the sound, her blue eyes darting to the man who had just hit the target dead center from 30 yards away. Jackson Keller tipped his hat back with the barrel of his still smoking Colt, his lips curling into a confident smile as the onlookers erupted in applause. She had seen that same self-assured grin directed her way more times than she could count in the 3 months since arriving in town. Violet smoothed her hands over her simple calico dress, her throat tight as she watched 3 other cowboys take their positions, each one glancing her way before taking their shots. Ever since her arrival in Snake River to take over her late uncle's bookshop in the spring of 1877, she had become the unwitting prize in an unspoken competition among the eligible men in town. "They're still showing off for you," a voice said beside her. Violet turned to see Mrs. Hollister, the baker's wife, giving her a knowing smile. "I wish they wouldn't," she replied, tucking a strand of auburn hair back into place. "I'm here to run a business, not to find a husband." "Good luck with that, dear," Mrs. Hollister chuckled. "You're the only unmarried woman under 30 who can read above a 3rd grade level in 50 miles. These boys have been waiting for someone like you." Violet sighed, watching as Emmett Taylor, the blacksmith's son, missed his shot entirely when he was distracted by her presence at the edge of the crowd. Another round of laughter erupted, causing the young man's face to burn crimson beneath his tan. "Miss Evans," called out Thomas Reed as he holstered his pistol and approached her with long strides. His family owned the largest cattle ranch outside of town, and he never let anyone forget it. "I was hoping you might join me for supper at the hotel restaurant this evening." Before Violet could answer, Jackson Keller appeared at her other side. "Now, Tom, I believe Miss Evans already promised the next social engagement to me. Isn't that right, Violet?" His voice carried the lazy drawl of a man who knew his own charm. Violet felt her temper rising. "I don't recall promising anything to either of you gentlemen." A third cowboy, Samuel Wilson, the town's deputy, joined the gathering circle. "Miss Evans, I brought you these," he said, holding out a small bunch of wildflowers clearly picked from the prairie grass just outside town. Violet accepted them with forced politeness, feeling increasingly trapped. "Thank you, Deputy Wilson. That's very thoughtful." As the men continued their posturing, Violet caught sight of someone watching from the edge of the celebration. James Keating stood slightly apart from the others, his lean frame propped against a hitching post, observing the proceedings with quiet amusement. Unlike the others who had been vying for her attention since her arrival, he had kept a respectful distance, offering only polite nods when they passed on the street, and occasionally stopping by the bookshop to purchase something to read. When their eyes met across the dusty street, he didn't immediately approach or call out. He simply tipped his hat in acknowledgement before returning his attention to the ongoing contest. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Violet said suddenly, cutting through the chorus of invitations and compliments. "I should return to my shop. There's inventory to be done before closing." She made her escape, clutching the wildflowers and ignoring the disappointed protests behind her. The spring air was warm against her skin as she walked briskly down the wooden sidewalk toward her uncle's, now her bookshop, the only one in Snake River and possibly the entire county. As she pushed open the door, the familiar scent of paper and leather bindings greeted her, bringing a genuine smile to her face for the first time that day. This was her sanctuary, the reason she had left her position as a teacher's assistant in Boston to come west after receiving word of her uncle's passing. She had been his only living relative, and rather than sell the bookshop from afar, she had decided to see it for herself. 1 month had turned into 3, and now she couldn't imagine leaving. The bell above the door jingled again as Violet was organizing a new shipment of books that had arrived on yesterday's stagecoach. "We're closed for lunch," she called without looking up, assuming it was one of her persistent suitors. "I can come back later," came the quiet reply. Violet turned to find James Keating standing just inside the doorway, his hat in his hands. At 30, he was older than most of her other admirers, and there was a steadiness to him that set him apart. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his clothing, while not fancy, was clean and well kept. "Mr. Keating," she said, surprised. "I'm sorry, I thought you might be someone else." "One of your many admirers, no doubt," he said with a slight smile. "I don't mean to intrude. I was just hoping you might have received that copy of Whitman we discussed." Violet brightened. "As a matter of fact, it came in yesterday's shipment." She moved to the counter where she had set aside several books for specific customers. "I was planning to send word to you tomorrow." She handed him the volume of Leaves of Grass, watching as he ran his fingers reverently over the embossed cover. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "How much do I owe you?" Violet quoted the price, and he counted out the money carefully. Unlike Thomas Reed, who always made a show of how easily he could pay, or Jackson Keller, who tried to charm his way into discounts, James simply paid what was due without comment. As she wrapped the book in brown paper, Violet found herself curious about this quiet man who seemed more interested in poetry than in impressing her. "You have quite the literary taste, Mr. Keating," she observed. "Most men around here only buy practical manuals or the occasional dime novel." He shrugged. "I was fortunate to have a mother who valued education. She taught school back in Pennsylvania before marrying my father and coming west." "And what brought you to Snake River?" she asked, tying the package with twine. For a moment, something shadowed his eyes. "The war left many of us looking for new beginnings," he said simply. Violet nodded, understanding. The Civil War had ended 12 years ago, but its effects still rippled through the country, especially in the lives of those who had fought. "What about you, Miss Evans?" he asked, surprising her. "What made you stay in Snake River? Surely a woman of your education had other opportunities back east." The question caught her off guard. None of her other suitors had ever asked about her reasons for being in Snake River, beyond expressing their good fortune that such a pretty woman had come to town. They certainly hadn't asked about what she might have given up to be there. I suppose I found something unexpected here," she admitted. "My uncle's legacy is more than just books. He created a place where ideas could flourish, even in a frontier town. I'd like to continue that." James nodded, a genuine interest in his eyes that made her flush slightly. "That's a worthy dream. Do you have dreams, Mr. Keating?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He seemed taken aback for a moment, then smiled fully for the first time since she'd known him. It transformed his face, softening the lines around his eyes. "I do," he said. "Though I'm not sure anyone's asked me that in quite some time." He glanced toward the window, where they could see the town's activity continuing. "Perhaps that's a conversation for another time, when you're not meant to be closed for lunch." Violet found herself reluctant to see him go. "I was just about to make some tea. You're welcome to stay if you'd like to continue our conversation." James hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that very much, Miss Evans." As they moved to the small sitting area at the back of the shop, where Violet kept a kettle and tea set for her personal use, she realized this was the first time she'd invited any man in Snake River to spend time with her voluntarily. Something about James Keating's quiet dignity and genuine interest in her thoughts made him different from the others who saw her only as a potential wife, a prize to be won in their ongoing competition. Little did she know that this simple conversation over tea would be the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she wanted from her life in the West. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with the kind of pristine blue sky that seemed to stretch endlessly over the Wyoming territory. Violet opened the bookshop earlier than usual, her mind still lingering on the previous day's conversation with James. They had talked for nearly 2 hours about books, poetry, and their respective journeys westward. He had told her about his small ranch outside of town, where he raised horses rather than cattle, a choice that had earned him some ridicule from the larger ranchers, but allowed him a more solitary and peaceful existence. What struck her most was his attentive listening when she spoke of her dreams for the bookshop, how she wanted to expand the selection to include more scientific works, perhaps organize reading groups for the town's children, or even start a small lending library for those who couldn't afford to buy books outright. "Good morning, Miss Evans." Jackson Keller's voice interrupted her thoughts as he sauntered into the shop, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. He carried a small package wrapped in colored paper. "I brought you something sweet from Mrs. Hollister's bakery." "That's very kind, Mr. Keller," she replied, accepting the gift with a polite smile. "But unnecessary." "Nothing's too good for the prettiest woman in Snake River," he said, leaning casually against her counter. At 28, Jackson was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in town, handsome, charming, and employed as the foreman at the Reed Ranch, which gave him both status and a steady income. "Was there a book you were looking for today?" Violet asked, trying to steer the conversation to business. Jackson laughed. "You know I'm not much for reading, Violet. I came to see you." His blue eyes twinkled as he added, "And to invite you to the town dance this Saturday. I'd be honored to escort you." Before Violet could respond, the door opened again, and Thomas Reed entered. At 25, he was younger than Jackson but carried himself with the confidence of a man who had inherited wealth and position. "Miss Evans," he greeted her, pointedly ignoring Jackson. "I've just returned from Cheyenne with some things for the ranch, and I found this." He presented a leather-bound journal with an ornate clasp. "I remembered you mentioning your fondness for writing, and I thought you might appreciate something finer than those plain notebooks you use." Violet blinked at the expensive gift. "Mr. Reed, I couldn't possibly. Please call me Thomas," he interrupted. "And I insist. It's a small token of my esteem." His gaze slid to Jackson, a challenging look passing between the men. "I was hoping to claim your company for the town dance this weekend." Jackson straightened, all traces of his easy smile vanishing. "I believe I just asked the lady the same question, Reed." Thomas shrugged. "Then she'll have to decide which of us she prefers, won't she?" Violet felt her temper rising. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the gestures," but the bell jingled again and Deputy Wilson entered, looking uncomfortable as he sensed the tension in the room. "Miss Evans," he said, nodding politely to the other men. "I was wondering if those law books I ordered had arrived yet." Grateful for the interruption, Violet moved to check her records. "Not yet, Deputy, but I'm expecting them on tomorrow's stage." "Then I'll return tomorrow," he said, then hesitated. "And perhaps you might allow me to escort you to the dance on Saturday. I know it's forward of me to ask, but, for heaven's sake," Violet exclaimed, her patience finally snapping. "Does every man in this town think I'm incapable of attending a public event without an escort?" The three men stared at her in surprise, and Violet immediately regretted her outburst. This wasn't Boston, where she could speak her mind freely. Here, she was dependent on the goodwill of the townspeople for her livelihood. "I apologize," she said more softly. That was unladylike of me. I simply meant that I haven't decided my plans for the dance yet. The uncomfortable silence was broken by the arrival of yet another visitor, James Keating. He paused in the doorway, taking in the tableau before him. 3 men clustered around Violet at the counter, her face flushed with emotion. "I can come back another time," he offered, already turning to leave. "No," Violet said too quickly, then composed herself. "I mean, please stay, Mr. Keating. I was just discussing the town dance with these gentlemen." James stepped inside, nodding to each of the men. Though he wasn't as physically imposing as Thomas or as flashy as Jackson, there was something in his quiet confidence that commanded respect. "Dance still on for Saturday at the town hall?" he asked casually. Thomas Reed eyed him with barely concealed disdain. "Planning to attend, Keating. Thought you preferred your own company out at that little horse farm of yours." If the insult bothered him, James didn't show it. "Even a solitary man enjoys a good fiddle tune now and then," he replied mildly. Jackson chuckled. "Well, you'd best find yourself a partner quick. All the eligible ladies get claimed fast, and as you can see," he gestured to Violet, "the most desirable one already has several offers." James's gaze met Violet's briefly. "I'm sure Miss Evans is capable of making her own choices without my adding to her burden." He turned his attention to the bookshelves. "I actually came to see if you had any books on horse breeding. I'm considering expanding my stable with some new bloodlines." Grateful for his tact, Violet moved from behind the counter. "I believe I have something that might help. If you'll excuse me, gentlemen." She led James to a section at the back of the shop, leaving her trio of suitors to exchange glares and muttered comments. "Thank you," she said quietly when they were out of earshot. "I was beginning to feel cornered." James selected a book from the shelf, pretending to examine it. "You seem to be handling it well enough," he replied, his voice equally low. "But I understand how persistent they can be. Thomas has always believed his family name entitles him to whatever he wants, and Jackson never met a challenge he didn't want to win. And Deputy Wilson," James smiled slightly. "Sam's a good man, just a bit too eager to please." He replaced the book and selected another. "You don't owe any of them your time or attention, you know." Violet sighed. "I know that in principle, but the reality of being a woman alone in a town this size is complicated. I can't afford to alienate potential customers, especially influential ones like the Reeds." "True enough," James acknowledged. "So what will you do about the dance?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to stay home with a good book, but that would only delay the inevitable. They'd just find another occasion to press their suits." James was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the spine of the book he held. "You could attend on your own terms," he suggested. "Arrive alone, dance with whomever you please, leave when you're ready." "Is that what you plan to do?" she asked. He met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "I haven't decided yet," he said softly. The sound of a throat clearing broke the moment. Thomas Reed stood at the end of the aisle, his expression tight. "I don't mean to interrupt your book discussion, but I must be getting back to the ranch. Miss Evans, I'll await your decision about Saturday." He gave James a curt nod before turning on his heel. One by one, the other men made their excuses and left, each reminding Violet of their invitation for the dance. When the shop was finally empty except for the two of them, Violet let out a long breath. "Is it always like this?" she asked, returning to the counter. James followed, placing his selected book before her. "Not usually. Snake River's been lacking in unmarried ladies for some time. The last one who came through married the stagecoach driver within a week and moved on to California." Despite her frustration, Violet laughed. "Well, I have no plans to marry a stagecoach driver or anyone else. I came here for independence, not to exchange one form of dependency for another." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "A radical notion in these parts. And what about you, Mr. Keating?" she asked as she wrapped his purchase. "No interest in finding a wife to share your solitary existence?" Something flickered across his face, a shadow of old pain, quickly masked. "I had a wife once. She died in childbirth 6 years ago along with our son." Violet's hand stilled on the wrapping paper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "No reason you should," he replied gently. "It happened back in Colorado before I came to Wyoming. Most folks here don't know much about my past, and I prefer it that way." "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. He paid for the book, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. "Thank you for listening," he replied, and she understood he meant more than just in that moment. After he left, Violet found herself thinking about their conversation throughout the day. Of all the men who had shown interest in her, James Keating was the only one who seemed to see her as a person with her own thoughts and aspirations, not just a potential wife to be claimed. By the time she closed the shop that evening, she had made her decision about the dance, one that would surprise everyone in Snake River, including herself. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of spectacular sunset that painted the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Violet stood before the small mirror in her living quarters above the bookshop, pinning the last strands of her auburn hair into a simple but elegant style. Her dress was her finest, a deep blue satin that she had brought from Boston but had found little occasion to wear in Snake River. The town dance was the social event of the season, held in the newly constructed town hall that doubled as a church on Sundays. For the occasion, the building would be transformed with paper lanterns, musicians brought in from the neighboring town, and refreshments provided by every family who could contribute. Violet had spent the week deflecting questions about whom she had chosen to escort her, smiling mysteriously and changing the subject whenever Jackson, Thomas, or Samuel pressed for an answer. Even Mrs. Hollister had tried to extract information during her daily visit to purchase a newspaper for her husband. "A lady is entitled to her secrets," Violet had told her with a wink, enjoying for once the power of keeping others guessing. The truth was simpler and more complicated than anyone might have imagined. She planned to attend alone, as James had suggested to claim her independence in this small way. But there was another truth she was reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. She hoped to see James there, to perhaps share a dance with the quiet horseman who had shown her more respect than all her other suitors combined. As she made her final preparations, a knock sounded at her door. Frowning slightly, she wasn't expecting anyone. Violet descended the narrow staircase that connected her living quarters to the shop below. Through the glass panel in the door, she could make out the silhouette of a woman. "Clara," Violet said in surprise as she opened the door to find Clara Matthews, the schoolteacher, standing on her doorstep. "Is everything all right, Clara?" A few years older than Violet and one of the few educated women in Snake River, smiled warmly. "Everything's fine. I just thought you might like some company walking to the dance. Safety in numbers, you know." Violet laughed, relieved and touched by the gesture. "How did you know I needed rescuing?" "I've seen the way those cowboys have been circling you like wolves around a lamb," Clara replied with a knowing look. "I figured you might appreciate avoiding their doorstep vigil this evening." "You're a godsend," Violet said gratefully, fetching her shawl. "I was dreading the awkwardness of arriving and having to immediately decline 3 separate offers to sit with them." Clara linked her arm through Violet's as they set off down the darkening street. "That's what friends are for. Besides, I remember what it was like when I first arrived 2 years ago. Until I made it clear I had no interest in marriage, I couldn't step outside without some cowboy offering to carry my books or walk me home. How did you make it clear? Violet asked curiously. Clara's eyes twinkled with mischief. I may have mentioned that I took a vow to devote myself to education after a tragic love affair back east. The story grew with each telling until people believed I was practically a nun. Violet burst into laughter. You didn't. I most certainly did, Clara replied smugly. And it worked beautifully. Now I'm left in peace to teach my students and live my life on my terms. As they approached the town hall, they could hear the music already playing inside, the warm glow of lanterns spilling from the windows. Several couples were making their way inside, the women in their finest dresses and the men looking uncomfortable but proud in stiff collars and polished boots. Ready? Clara asked as they paused at the entrance. Violet took a deep breath and nodded. As I'll ever be. They stepped inside to a scene of surprising beauty. The plain wooden hall had been transformed with streamers, flowers, and dozens of lanterns. A small group of musicians played on a raised platform at one end, while tables of food and punch lined the other. Nearly everyone in Snake River and the surrounding ranches seemed to be in attendance, creating a sea of color and movement. It took only moments for Violet to spot her trio of persistent suitors. Jackson Keller was holding court near the punch bowl, surrounded by admiring listeners as he recounted some tale. Thomas Reed stood with his parents, the wealthiest family in the region, looking bored until his gaze locked on Violet and brightened considerably. Samuel Wilson hovered near the door as if waiting specifically for her arrival, his face lighting up when he spotted her. Incoming, Clara murmured, nodding toward Samuel as he started making his way through the crowd toward them. Before he could reach them, however, Mayor Gardner stepped to the center of the room and called for everyone's attention, inadvertently providing Violet with a momentary reprieve. Ladies and gentlemen of Snake River, the portly mayor announced, welcome to our spring dance. Before we continue the festivities, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to making this evening possible. As the mayor droned on with his acknowledgments, Violet let her gaze wander around the room. Her heart skipped when she finally spotted James Keating standing against the far wall. Unlike the other men who had donned their Sunday best, James wore simple but clean clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest. His dark hair was combed neatly, and though he didn't stand out in the crowd, there was a quiet dignity to his presence that drew her eye. As if sensing her attention, he looked up, their eyes meeting across the crowded room. He inclined his head slightly in greeting, a small smile touching his lips. The mayor finally concluded his speech, and the music resumed a lively reel that sent couples swirling onto the dance floor. Almost immediately, Samuel appeared at Violet's side. "Miss Evans, you look absolutely lovely tonight," he said earnestly. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Before Violet could respond, Thomas Reed materialized beside her, his expression determined. "I believe Miss Evans promised the first dance to me, Deputy." "I did no such," Violet began, but was interrupted by Jackson's arrival. "Gentlemen," Jackson said smoothly, "perhaps we should let the lady decide for herself." All three men turned expectant gazes to Violet, who felt a flush rising to her cheeks at being the center of attention. Other dancers were beginning to notice the standoff, and whispers spread through the crowd. She faltered, then felt Clara's reassuring hand on her arm. "Actually," Clara interjected, "Miss Evans promised this dance to me. Lady's choice, you know." Without waiting for a response, Clara pulled Violet onto the dance floor, leaving the three men staring after them in confusion. "Thank you," Violet said as they joined the line of dancers. Again. Clara grinned. You can thank me by telling me which one of them you actually favor, if any. The entire town is placing bets, you know. They're what? Violet nearly missed a step in the dance. Oh yes, Mrs. Hollister has a book going at the bakery. Last I heard, Jackson was the favorite at 2-to-1 odds, with Thomas close behind because of his family's money. Violet was mortified. And Samuel, 5-to-1, Clara replied. He's sweet but lacks the confidence of the others. This is humiliating, Violet muttered as they circled each other in the dance. Welcome to small-town life, Clara said philosophically. If it's any consolation, there are a few bets on dark horse candidates. The blacksmith's son, the new doctor who arrived last month, and even, she paused, eyes twinkling, James Keating, though he's at very long odds indeed. Violet nearly stumbled again. James, but he's hardly shown any interest. Clara gave her a knowing look. Hasn't he? I've seen him leaving your shop more times in the past month than in the entire year before you arrived, and he's watching you right now. Violet resisted the urge to look over her shoulder. We share an interest in literature, that's all. Hum, Clara hummed skeptically as the dance came to an end. Well, your literary admirer is about to have competition again. Sure enough, as they left the dance floor, Thomas Reed intercepted them, smoothly offering Violet his arm. I believe it's my turn now, Miss Evans. With a resigned smile to Clara, Violet allowed Thomas to lead her back onto the floor as a waltz began. He was an excellent dancer, guiding her confidently through the steps while maintaining a respectable distance between them. You look radiant tonight, he said, his gaze admiring. That color suits you perfectly. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Thomas, please, he corrected gently. We've known each other long enough for that familiarity, haven't we? Violet nodded, wondering if she could survive an entire evening of this, being passed from one suitor to the next like a prize to be claimed. After Thomas came Jackson, who held her closer than propriety strictly allowed and whispered compliments that made her blush despite herself. Then Samuel, who stepped on her toes twice, but apologized so profusely she couldn't help but forgive him. By the time she begged a rest and made her way to the refreshment table, Violet was exhausted not just physically, but emotionally. The constant attention, the expectant gazes, the not-so-subtle competition between her suitors, it was all becoming too much. She was sipping punch in a quiet corner when a deep voice beside her asked, "Enjoying your evening, Miss Evans?" James Keating stood there, 2 plates of food in his hands. He offered one to her. "You haven't had a chance to eat yet. I thought you might be hungry." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her more deeply than all the flowery compliments and expensive gifts she'd received. "Thank you," she said, accepting the plate gratefully. "And yes, I suppose I am enjoying myself in between moments of feeling like a prize heifer at auction." James chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. An apt comparison, though I'd never dare say it aloud myself. Violet smiled, some of her tension easing in his company. "Tell me honestly, Mr. Keating, is my situation as much the talk of the town as Clara suggests?" "I'm afraid so," he admitted. "But if it's any consolation, most folks admire the way you've handled yourself with grace and dignity, despite the rather undignified behavior of certain gentlemen." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the dancers swirl around the floor. Jackson was now dancing with the banker's daughter, his charm on full display, while Thomas engaged in conversation with the mayor, no doubt discussing business matters. "They're good men, you know," James said suddenly, "for all their posturing and competition. Jackson's loyal to a fault, Thomas is generous despite his privileged upbringing, and Samuel would lay down his life to protect this town." Violet looked at him in surprise. That's remarkably charitable, given how they treat you, James shrugged. We all have our stories, our reasons for becoming who we are. I try not to judge too harshly. And what's your story, Mr. Keating? Violet asked softly. Beyond what you've already told me. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. I came west before the war, worked cattle drives, tried my hand at mining. When the fighting started, I went back east to enlist with the Union. Spent 4 years seeing the worst of humanity. He paused, his eyes distant. After Appomattox, I couldn't face going home to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts, so I drifted until I met my wife in Denver. We had 2 good years before. He trailed off. Before you lost her, Violet finished gently. He nodded. After that, I wanted solitude, bought that small spread outside town, started breeding horses. It's quiet work, gives a man time to think. And what do you think about? She asked. His eyes met hers, surprisingly direct. Lately. About how a bookshop owner with auburn hair and strong opinions might fare raising horses instead of running a store. Violet's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a declaration of love, or even a formal courtship offer, but in its way, it was more meaningful than all the showy gestures of her other suitors combined. He was sharing a piece of his dream with her, inviting her to consider if it might align with her own. Before she could respond, the music changed to a slower waltz, and James set aside his plate. "Would you care to dance, Miss Evans?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm not as practiced as Reed or as flashy as Keller, but I promise not to step on your toes." Violet placed her hand in his, feeling calluses that spoke of honest work. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Keating, and please call me Violet." "Violet," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "Then you must call me James." As he led her onto the dance floor, Violet was acutely aware of the eyes following them, particularly those of her trio of regular suitors. Let them watch, she thought with sudden defiance. For the first time since arriving in Snake River, she was making a choice based solely on what she wanted, not on what others expected of her. James proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her with gentle confidence through the waltz. He maintained a proper distance between them, yet there was an intimacy in the way his eyes held hers that made her heart beat faster than the exertion of dancing could explain. "May I ask you something, Violet?" he said as they moved through the steps. "Of course. What are your dreams? Not just for the bookshop, but for yourself. If you could have any life you wanted, what would it look like?" The question startled her. No one had asked her that since she was a young girl, least of all a man who might have romantic intentions toward her. Her other suitors assumed they knew what she wanted: marriage, children, security, without ever bothering to ask. She began, then paused, collecting her thoughts. "I want to build something meaningful. The bookshop is part of that, bringing knowledge and stories to people who might otherwise never experience them. But beyond that," she took a breath, deciding to trust him with the truth. "I want to write stories of my own, perhaps even a novel someday." "What kind of stories?" he asked, his interest clearly genuine. "Stories about the West, not the mythical version with heroic cowboys and helpless maidens, but the real West. The struggles and triumphs of ordinary people building lives in extraordinary circumstances. Women who came here for their own reasons, not just following husbands or fathers. Men who sought redemption or second chances." She expected him to laugh or dismiss her ambition as a feminine fancy, as others had when she dared to mention it. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "I'd read those stories," he said simply. "The West needs its true chroniclers, not just the dime novelists back east who have never set foot beyond the Mississippi." The music was drawing to a close, and Violet felt an unexpected reluctance for the dance to end. "And what about your dreams, James?" she asked quickly. Beyond your horse farm, a shadow crossed his face, quickly replaced by a wry smile. For many years I didn't allow myself to dream of anything. Surviving was enough. The music ended, but he kept hold of her hand. Lately, though, I've been thinking there might be room for more. Before he could elaborate, Jackson appeared beside them, his expression tight beneath his easy smile. "Mind if I cut in, Keating? Miss Evans promised me another dance." James released Violet's hand, stepping back with a slight bow. "That's for the lady to decide." Both men looked to her, and Violet felt the weight of the moment. This was more than a choice between dance partners. It was a public declaration of preference that the entire town would notice and discuss. Drawing herself up, she smiled politely at Jackson. "Actually, Mr. Keller, I was just telling Mr. Keating that I needed some air. Perhaps another time." Without waiting for a response, she turned to James. "Would you be kind enough to escort me outside for a moment?" Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "It would be my pleasure." As they made their way through the crowd toward the doors, Violet was keenly aware of the whispers and stares following them. By tomorrow, her choice to leave the dance floor with James Keating would be the talk of Snake River, possibly altering the odds in Mrs. Hollister's betting book. The night air was cool and refreshing after the warmth of the crowded hall. A few other couples had also stepped outside, seeking privacy in the shadows of the building or strolling along the moonlit street. James led Violet to a bench beneath a large cottonwood tree, far enough from others to speak privately. "Thank you," she said as they sat down. "I hope I didn't embarrass you by using you as an escape route." James chuckled softly. "Not at all, though I suspect Keller's pride is somewhat wounded. He's not used to ladies preferring other company to his." "It wasn't just an excuse," Violet admitted. "I've enjoyed talking with you more than anyone else this evening." She hesitated, then added, "More than anyone since coming to Snake River, if I'm being honest." In the silvery moonlight, she could see his expression soften. "The feeling is mutual, Violet." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the muted music and laughter from inside, the occasional whinny of horses tied at the hitching posts, and the distant yipping of coyotes from the hills beyond town. "Will you tell me more about your ranch?" Violet asked eventually. "You mentioned breeding horses." James nodded, relaxing into the subject. "I've got about 80 acres along the Snake River, 10 miles east of town. Started with just 4 mares and a stallion I brought from Colorado. Now I've got 15 breeding mares and 3 stallions." There was quiet pride in his voice. "I'm focusing on breeding horses that can handle the Wyoming winters and rough terrain but still have the speed and endurance for ranch work." "That sounds fascinating," Violet said, genuinely interested. "Have you had success?" "Some. My colts are starting to develop a reputation for being both tough and intelligent. Sold 2 to the Army last year for their officers, and Thomas Reed, for all his other faults, has purchased several for his ranch." "I'd love to see them someday," Violet said, then blushed at her forwardness. James turned to face her more directly. "I'd like that," he said seriously. "Very much." The intensity of his gaze made her heart flutter. Violet was suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the moonlight silvering his dark hair, of the warmth of his presence beside her on the bench. "Violet," he began, his voice low, "I know I'm not the sort of man most people would expect you to. There you are, Miss Evans." Thomas Reed's voice cut through the night air as he approached from the direction of the town hall, his expression a careful mask of concern. "Everyone's wondering where you've gone. The mayor's wife is organizing a ladies' circle dance and specifically asked for you to join." James stood smoothly, creating a respectful distance between himself and Violet. "Mr. Raid," he acknowledged with a nod. Thomas barely spared him a glance. "Keating." He extended his arm to Violet. "Shall we, Miss Evans? It would be impolite to keep Mrs. Gardiner waiting." Violet hesitated, torn between her desire to continue her conversation with James and her awareness of social expectations. As an unmarried woman new to town, she was already pushing the boundaries of propriety by sitting alone with James in the moonlight. "You should go," James said quietly, understanding in his eyes. "We can continue our conversation another time." With a grateful nod, Violet stood and reluctantly took Thomas's arm. As he led her back toward the brightly lit hall, she glanced over her shoulder to see James still standing beneath the cottonwood tree, watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite read in the shadows. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of dances, conversations, and careful navigation of her suitors' attentions. James returned to the dance, but kept his distance, speaking with the blacksmith and a few of the older ranchers, occasionally catching Violet's eye across the room with a small smile that seemed meant only for her. By the time Clara joined her for the walk home near midnight, Violet was both exhausted and exhilarated. The physical fatigue of dancing for hours was nothing compared to the emotional complexity of the evening, particularly her interrupted conversation with James. "So," Clara said as they made their way down the darkened street, their way lit by the full moon overhead, "the mysterious James Keating, that's an interesting choice." Violet feigned innocence. "I don't know what you mean. We simply shared a dance and a conversation." Clara snorted delicately. "Please. You disappeared with him for 20 minutes, then spent the rest of the night exchanging glances that practically set the room on fire. The betting odds at Mrs. Hollister's will be completely upended by morning." Despite her embarrassment, Violet couldn't help laughing. "Is it really so obvious?" "Only to everyone with eyes," Clara replied dryly. Thomas looked like he'd swallowed something sour for the rest of the night, and Jackson doubled his charm offensive with every eligible woman in the room to salvage his pride. She paused. "For what it's worth, I think Keating is a good man. Quiet, respectful, keeps to himself, but those who have done business with him say he's fair and honest." "He asked me about my dreams," Violet said softly. "Not what I wanted in a husband or a home, but what I dreamed of for myself." "No one's ever asked me that before, at least not since I was a child." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's rare," she finally said. "Most men around here assume a woman's dreams begin and end with a wedding ring and a cradle." "Exactly," Violet agreed. "Yet James seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, my ambitions beyond marriage and family." They had reached the bookshop, and Violet fished in her reticule for the key. As they stood in the pool of moonlight before the door, Clara studied her friend's face. "You like him," she stated simply. More than just as a friend or a customer. Violet felt a blush creep into her cheeks but didn't deny it. "I hardly know him." "But you want to?" Clara pressed gently. After a moment's hesitation, Violet nodded. "Yes," she admitted. "I do." Clara smiled. "Then I suggest you find a reason to visit his ranch and see those horses he breeds. Preferably before Thomas Raid or Jackson Keller decide to take more drastic measures to win your hand." With a quick embrace, Clara bid her good night and continued down the street to her own small house near the schoolhouse. As Violet climbed the stairs to her quarters, her mind was filled with the evening's events and with possibilities she had never before considered for her future in Snake River. The week following the dance brought a flurry of activity to the bookshop. News of Violet's apparent preference for James Keating spread through Snake River with predictable speed, and curious townspeople found sudden reasons to purchase books or newspapers. their real interest clearly being a glimpse of the woman who had bypassed the town's most eligible bachelors for the reclusive horse breeder. By Wednesday, Violet was exhausted from fielding thinly veiled inquiries and deflecting the increasingly bold attentions of her established suitors. Jackson had taken to bringing her lunch daily. Thomas sent a bouquet of expensive flowers imported from Denver, and Samuel stood guard outside the shop each evening to ensure her safety on the short walk to the restaurant where she took her dinner. James, meanwhile, had not returned to the bookshop since the dance. His absence left Violet alternately worried that she had misinterpreted his interest and annoyed that he would retreat just when her other suitors had intensified their pursuit. "Delivery for you, Miss Evans," called the stagecoach driver as he entered the shop Thursday afternoon, carrying a small wooden crate. "Special shipment from Cheyenne." Violet frowned, setting aside the inventory list she'd been reviewing. "I didn't order anything from Cheyenne this month." The driver shrugged, placing the crate on her counter. "Got your name on it plain as day. Someone paid extra to make sure it came through quick." After he left, Violet examined the crate curiously. It was addressed to her in a neat, unfamiliar hand with no indication of the sender. Using a letter opener to pry loose the lid, she gasped at what lay inside, nestled in straw padding. A journal bound in soft leather, far simpler than the ornate one Thomas had given her, yet somehow more beautiful in its understated elegance. Beside it lay a small wooden box containing an assortment of pencils and pens and a folded note. With trembling fingers, Violet opened the note, instantly recognizing the same handwriting that had addressed the crate. "For your stories of the real West. I look forward to reading them someday. If you're still interested in seeing those horses, I'll be in town on Saturday to deliver a colt to the livery stable. J.K." Violet traced her fingers over the writing, a smile spreading across her face. Unlike Thomas's expensive gift, which had felt like an attempt to impress her, James's present showed genuine understanding of her dreams and aspirations. He had not only remembered her desire to write, but had provided the tools to pursue it. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her reverie. She looked up to find Jackson Keller standing there, a covered basket in his hands. "Afternoon, Miss Evans," he greeted her with his customary charm. "Thought you might enjoy some of Mrs. Hollister's fresh bread and preserves for your supper tonight." "That's very kind, Mr. Keller," Violet replied, discreetly slipping James's note into her pocket. "But unnecessary, as I've told you before." Jackson set the basket on the counter, his eyes drifting to the open crate and its contents. "Seems I'm not the only one bringing gifts," he observed, a hint of tension beneath his easy smile. "Anything special? Just some writing supplies," Violet answered vaguely. Jackson picked up the journal, turning it over in his hands. "Nice workmanship. Not as fancy as what Thomas gave you, but solid." He glanced at her with unexpected perception. "From Keating, I'd wager." Violet didn't deny it, lifting her chin slightly. "Mr. Keating is aware of my interest in writing." "Is that what draws you to him?" Jackson asked, setting the journal down carefully. "His interest in your literary pursuits." There was something in his tone, not mockery exactly, but a kind of puzzled skepticism that sparked Violet's temper. "Mr. Keating treats me as a person with my own thoughts and ambitions," she said more sharply than intended. "Not as a prize to be won or a position to be filled." Jackson's confident expression faltered, genuine surprise and something like hurt flashing across his handsome features. "Is that how you think I see you? As a prize?" Violet immediately regretted her harshness. For all his flirtation and persistence, Jackson had never been disrespectful toward her. "I apologize, Mr. Keller. That was unfair of me." He shook his head, an unusual seriousness settling over him. No, perhaps it wasn't. He moved to the window, looking out at the dusty main street for a long moment before turning back to her. You're right that there's been an element of competition in my pursuit. I've never had to work particularly hard for a lady's attention before. The frank admission startled Violet. This glimpse of self-awareness was unexpected from the usually self-assured cowboy. "Why me, Mr. Keller?" she asked quietly. "Snake River may not be overflowing with unmarried women, but there are others. Why such persistence with someone who has shown so little encouragement?" Jackson considered the question, absently turning his hat in his hands. "You're different," he finally said. "Most girls around here, they're looking for security, a comfortable home, maybe a bit of excitement now and then. He gestured to the bookshop around them. You built this yourself, came all the way from Boston on your own. You have fire and independence. I admire that." Violet blinked, surprised by the insight. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I've been going about it all wrong, haven't I?" Jackson continued, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Showing off my riding and shooting, bringing you gifts, treating it all like some kind of contest. Those things aren't wrong," Violet clarified. "They're just incomplete. You've shown me what you can provide, but not who you are. Not what matters to you beyond winning." Jackson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his blue eyes. "And Keating has." It wasn't a question, but Violet answered anyway. "He's shown interest in knowing me, not just courting me." A customer entered the shop then, ending their unexpectedly revealing conversation. As Jackson tipped his hat in farewell, he paused at the door. "I hope you enjoy the bread, Miss Evans," he said. "And if you're amenable, perhaps we might have a real conversation sometime about books or dreams or whatever interests you. I'm not as educated as Keating, but I can listen." The sincerity in his voice touched her. "I'd like that, Mr. Keller." After he left, Violet found herself reflecting on their exchange while helping the customer find a gift for his wife's birthday. Had she misjudged Jackson? Was there more depth to him than the charming, competitive cowboy he presented to the world? The thought stayed with her through the evening as she enjoyed the fresh bread and blackberry preserves he had brought, making notes in her new journal by lamplight. Perhaps there was more to all her suitors than she had initially perceived. Thomas's arrogance might mask insecurity. Samuel's awkward devotion might hide genuine feeling, and Jackson's competitive pursuit might conceal real admiration. But it was James's gift that sat before her as she wrote. James's understanding of her dreams that had provided the means to pursue them, and James's quiet invitation to visit his ranch that quickened her pulse when she thought of the coming Saturday. By the time she extinguished her lamp and prepared for bed, Violet had made her decision. She would meet James at the livery stable on Saturday not as a woman being courted, but as someone pursuing her own interest in seeing his horses and perhaps gathering material for the stories she hoped to write. If their mutual interest developed into something more, it would be on equal footing, with both of their dreams acknowledged and respected. With that resolution made, Violet slept more soundly than she had since arriving in Snake River, her dreams filled with wide open spaces, running horses, and a quiet man with understanding eyes who asked questions no one else had thought to ask. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect blue Wyoming sky that seemed to stretch endlessly above the town. Violet opened the bookshop earlier than usual, hoping to complete her weekly accounting before her planned visit to the livery stable. She had decided not to announce her intentions to anyone, preferring to avoid the inevitable gossip that would follow her being seen with James. The morning passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers keeping her busy until noon. Just as she was preparing to close for her midday meal, Thomas Reid entered the shop, dressed in his finest suit despite the casual nature of a Saturday in Snake River. "Miss Evans," he greeted her with a formal bow. "You look lovely today, as always." "Thank you, Mr. Reid," she replied, continuing to tidy the counter. "What brings you to town? I would have thought Saturday would be a busy day at the ranch." Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "The foreman can handle things for a day. I had more important matters to attend to in town." He straightened his already impeccable cuffs. "In fact, I came specifically to invite you to dine with my family tomorrow after church. My mother is most eager to make your acquaintance." Violet paused in her work, recognizing the significance of such an invitation. In Snake River's social hierarchy, dining with the Reids was tantamount to receiving their approval, and in Thomas's case, it suggested a serious intent beyond mere courtship. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but I usually use Sundays to catch up on my correspondence and prepare for the week ahead." Thomas's confident smile didn't waver. "Surely you can spare a few hours." "My mother has instructed the cook to prepare her famous roast beef, and Father is opening a bottle of wine he imported from California." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Violet, may I call you Violet? It would mean a great deal to me personally if you would accept." The earnestness in his voice made refusing more difficult than she had anticipated. Despite his occasional arrogance, Thomas had been unfailingly polite in his pursuit, and she had no wish to humiliate him with an outright rejection. "Very well," she conceded. "I would be honored to join your family for dinner tomorrow." Thomas's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Excellent. I'll send the carriage for you after the service." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you know how much I admire you, Violet. Not just your beauty, but your independence and determination. It's rare to find such qualities in a woman." The compliment seemed sincere, and Violet found herself smiling. "Thank you, Thomas. That means more than the gifts and flattery," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm learning." With a tip of his hat, he departed, leaving Violet with mixed feelings about her acceptance. She had no romantic interest in Thomas Reid, yet she couldn't deny that dining with his family would be both a social achievement and an opportunity to experience a level of refinement rarely found in frontier towns. As the clock struck noon, Violet locked the shop door and hung the "closed for lunch" sign. Instead of heading to the restaurant as usual, however, she made her way toward the livery stable at the edge of town, her heart beating a little faster with each step. The livery was a large wooden structure with a corral attached to one side, the smell of hay, horse, and leather growing stronger as she approached. She could hear the sound of men's voices and the occasional whinny or stamp of a hoof from within. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Violet stepped through the wide doorway into the relative dimness of the stable. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust from the bright sunlight outside, but when they did, she immediately spotted James standing beside the most beautiful horse she had ever seen, a young stallion with a gleaming chestnut coat, his muscles rippling beneath the sleek hair as he tossed his head impatiently. James was speaking with the livery owner, but he glanced up at her entrance, surprise and pleasure crossing his face. "Miss Evans," he said, excusing himself from the other man and coming to meet her. "I wasn't sure if you would come." Violet smiled, suddenly self-conscious about her impulsive decision. "I was intrigued by your invitation," she replied, "and by this magnificent animal." "Is this the colt you mentioned?" James nodded, pride evident in his expression. "This is Thunderbolt, 2 years old and already showing his sire's speed and his dam's intelligence." He gestured for her to come closer. "Would you like to meet him?" Violet approached cautiously. She had little experience with horses beyond the occasional rented buggy ride in Boston's parks. "He's beautiful," she said, staying at what she judged to be a safe distance. "But rather large for a colt," James chuckled. "He's nearly full-grown. Another year and he'll be at his full strength." He held out his hand to her. "Here, he's gentle despite his size. Let me show you how to greet him properly." Hesitantly, Violet placed her hand in James's, feeling the same calluses she had noticed during their dance. His palm was warm and strong against hers as he guided her closer to the horse. "Hold your hand flat like this," he demonstrated. "Let him smell you first before you try to touch him. Horses are cautious by nature, but curious too." Violet did as instructed, holding her flattened palm toward the horse's velvet nose. Thunderbolt extended his neck, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. After a moment, he bumped her hand gently with his nose. "He likes you," James said, still standing close behind her. "Now you can stroke his face, just along here." He guided her hand to the horse's cheek, showing her how to move her fingers in a gentle caress. The horse leaned into her touch, his large, liquid eyes regarding her with what seemed like approval. Violet laughed softly in delight, her earlier nervousness forgotten. "He's wonderful," she said, continuing to stroke the sleek coat. "Did you raise him from birth?" James nodded, moving to stand beside her. "He was born during a thunderstorm, hence the name. His mother is my best mare, and his father is a stallion I brought from Kentucky 3 years ago. And you're selling him to the livery stable?" Violet asked, surprised that he would part with such a magnificent animal. "No," James replied. "Mr. Johnson is keeping him here temporarily while I'm in town. He's actually sold to the territorial governor's son. I'm delivering him to Cheyenne next week." Violet tried to hide her disappointment at the news that James would be leaving town, if only temporarily. "That must be quite an honor, to have the governor purchase one of your horses." "It is," he agreed. "It could mean more business from officials and army officers if Thunderbolt impresses them." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might do me a favor while I'm gone." "Of course," Violet said, curious. "What do you need?" James reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I've been keeping records of my breeding program, which bloodlines produce the best traits, which combinations to avoid. It's important work, but I'm not a writer like you." He handed her the paper. "I wondered if you might help me organize these notes into a more coherent system." Violet unfolded the paper to find several pages of careful notations about horses, their characteristics, and their offspring. The information was thorough but somewhat haphazardly arranged. "You want me to help you create a record-keeping system for your breeding program?" She clarified, touched by the request. Unlike the other men who saw her primarily as a potential wife, James was asking for her professional skills and intellect. "If you have the time and inclination," he said, "I'd compensate you fairly, of course." "I'd be happy to help," Violet replied, already studying the notes with interest. "And payment isn't necessary. I find this fascinating." James's expression softened. "Thank you." "I was also hoping," he paused, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant, "that you might consider visiting the ranch while I'm away. My foreman, Miguel, could show you the other horses. It might provide material for those stories you want to write." The invitation surprised and pleased her. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Though I'm not sure how I would get there. It's 10 miles, you said." "I could send Miguel with the wagon on Tuesday if that suits you," James offered. "You could spend the day, have lunch at the ranch, and he would return you to town before dark." Violet considered the proposal. Visiting a man's home in his absence was unusual but not scandalous, especially with his employee as chaperone. And the opportunity to see more of his horses and perhaps gain insights into James himself, by seeing where he lived, was too tempting to resist. Tuesday would be perfect, she agreed. The shop is always quiet that day. A genuine smile transformed James's usually serious face. Excellent. I'll make the arrangements with Miguel before I leave tomorrow. They spent another hour at the livery, with James showing her his saddle and explaining the special training methods he used with his horses. Throughout their conversation, he maintained a respectful distance, yet Violet was acutely aware of his presence, of the way his eyes lingered on her face when she spoke, of the care he took to explain things without condescension. As they walked back toward the main street together, James asked her about her progress with the journal he had sent. "I've started writing in it every evening," Violet admitted. "Just observations about the town and its people for now, but I hope to shape them into proper stories eventually." "I'm glad," he said simply. "Your perspective on Snake River and the West deserves to be recorded. Too many stories are told only from a man's point of view." They had reached the bookshop, and Violet hesitated at the door, reluctant for their time together to end. "Thank you for showing me Thunderbolt," she said, "and for trusting me with your breeding records." James stood with his hat in his hands, the sun highlighting the strands of silver at his temples, evidence of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. "The pleasure was mine, Violet." He replaced his hat, preparing to leave. "I should let you return to your work. I have preparations to make for my journey." "How long will you be in Cheyenne?" Violet asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "A week, perhaps 10 days," he replied. "I have other business to attend to while I'm there." He hesitated, then added, "I'll miss our conversations." The simple admission warmed her. "As will I." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with things unsaid. Then James cleared his throat. "Until Tuesday, then," he said, tipping his hat before turning to go. Violet watched him walk away, his tall figure straight and steady among the Saturday crowd on the street. Only when he had disappeared from view did she enter the shop, her mind already spinning with thoughts of Tuesday's visit to his ranch, and with the realization that she would have to navigate Sunday dinner with the Reeds without letting on that she had other interests. For the first time since arriving in Snake River, Violet felt the complexity of being a single woman in a small town. Her choices were observed, judged, and discussed by everyone around her. Yet as she unlocked the bookshop door, she found that she didn't regret a single moment of her time with James Keating, no matter what the town might say. Sunday morning found Violet seated in the town's small church, uncomfortably aware of the glances and whispers directed her way. Word had somehow spread, likely through the livery stable owner, that she had spent time with James Keating the previous day, and now she was about to dine with the Reed family. For a town starved of entertainment, her romantic entanglements provided rich fodder for speculation. The service seemed interminable, with Reverend Walsh droning on about the virtues of patience and the dangers of pride. Finally, it concluded with a hymn, and the congregation began to file out into the bright sunshine. Thomas was waiting for her on the church steps, resplendent in a suit that must have cost more than Violet's entire wardrobe. "Miss Evans," he greeted her formally, offering his arm. "The carriage is ready whenever you are." Violet placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, acutely aware of the watching townspeople. "I'm ready now, thank you." The Reed family carriage was an impressive sight in Snake River, a gleaming black conveyance with polished brass fittings and a team of matched bay horses. The driver, a middle-aged man in a neat uniform, opened the door as they approached. "After you," Thomas said, helping Violet into the plush interior. The ride to the Reed ranch took nearly half an hour, giving Violet her first real glimpse of the surrounding countryside, beyond what she could see from town. The landscape was both harsh and beautiful, rolling hills covered with prairie grass, stark rock formations in the distance, and the sinuous line of the Snake River winding through it all. The ranch itself was equally impressive. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of stone and timber, with a wide veranda wrapping around three sides. Around it clustered various outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses for the ranch hands. In the distance, Violet could see cattle grazing on the hillsides. "Welcome to Riverfront Ranch," Thomas said with undisguised pride as he helped her from the carriage. "My grandfather established it in 1850, one of the first permanent settlements in this valley." "It's magnificent," Violet admitted honestly. The scale and prosperity of the operation far exceeded anything she had imagined. Thomas's parents were waiting on the veranda. George Reed, a barrel-chested man with a thick mustache and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the elements, and Alina Reed, a slender woman with Thomas's features refined into aristocratic elegance, her gray hair arranged in an elaborate style that would have been at home in Boston or New York. "Miss Evans," George Reed boomed, coming forward to take her hand in a firm grip. "Delighted to finally meet the young lady who's been improving the mines of Snake River." Alina Reed's greeting was more reserved, her assessment of Violet swift and thorough. "How lovely to have you join us, Miss Evans. Thomas has spoken quite highly of you." "Thank you for your kind invitation, Mrs. Reed," Violet replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Your home is beautiful." Alina's expression thawed slightly. "Thank you, dear. We've worked hard to bring a bit of civilization to this wilderness." She linked her arm through Violet's, leading her into the house. "Thomas mentioned you're from Boston. Which part exactly?" What followed was a detailed interrogation, thinly disguised as polite conversation, as Alina Reed determined Violet's family background, education, social connections, and Violet's strongly suspected financial situation. By the time they were seated at the dining table, with its fine china and crystal that seemed wildly out of place in Wyoming territory, Violet felt thoroughly examined and categorized. The meal itself was as elaborate as promised: roast beef cooked to perfection, vegetables that must have been brought in at great expense, and wine that George Reed proudly announced had come all the way from a vineyard in California's Napa Valley. Throughout the dinner, Thomas spoke animatedly about his plans for expanding the ranch, his recent business dealings in Cheyenne, and his vision for Snake River's future. Violet noticed that his parents exchanged pleased glances whenever he included her in these future scenarios with phrases like "Violet and I could attend," or "we might consider." "The territory will achieve statehood within the next decade," George Reed predicted as they moved to coffee and dessert. "When that happens, men of vision will be needed in the new state government. I've already told Thomas he should consider a political career. Father thinks I should run for the territorial legislature next year," Thomas explained to Violet, "as a first step." "That's quite ambitious," Violet replied diplomatically, unsure how else to respond to these plans that seemed to include her by implication. "The Reed name carries weight in Wyoming," Alina said, stirring her coffee, "and a suitable wife would be essential for such endeavors." Her gaze rested meaningfully on Violet, a woman of education and refinement who understands society. The conversation's direction was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Violet set down her fork, searching for a way to gracefully change the subject without offending her hosts. "I understand you purchased horses from Mr. Keating for the ranch," she said, addressing George Reed. "What do you think of his breeding program?" A brief silence followed her question. Thomas looked surprised. Aliner's lips thinned slightly, and George cleared his throat before answering. "Keating knows horses, I'll give him that," he acknowledged gruffly. "Got a good eye for bloodlines. Bit of an odd duck, otherwise keeps to himself, reads too many books, but he raises solid stock." He eyed Violet curiously. "You know the man," Violet maintained a neutral expression. "He frequents the bookshop," she said simply. "We've discussed literature on occasion." "James Keating was a Union officer during the war," Aliner said, as if this explained something significant. "From a respectable Pennsylvania family, I believe, though there was some scandal that brought him west. He keeps his distance from town affairs, which some find peculiar." Thomas shifted in his seat, clearly displeased by the turn in conversation. "Keating's horses are adequate for ranch work," he said dismissively, "but nothing exceptional. Now, about that new school building, the town council is considering." The remainder of the visit passed in carefully guided conversation, with Thomas and his parents steering topics back to the Reed family's prominence in Snake River and their plans for the future. By the time Thomas escorted her back to town in the carriage, Violet was mentally exhausted from navigating the subtle and not so subtle hints about her potential place in their family. "I hope you enjoyed meeting my parents," Thomas said as they neared the bookshop. "They were quite impressed with you, especially Mother. She's particular about, well, everything, frankly." "They were very hospitable," Violet replied diplomatically. "Thank you for including me in your family dinner." Thomas reached across the carriage to take her hand, his expression suddenly earnest. "Violet, I hope you understand what today meant. My parents don't invite just anyone to Sunday dinner." He hesitated, then continued in a rush. "I know I haven't been as attentive to your interests as perhaps I should have been. Jackson pointed out that I've been too focused on impressing you with what I can provide rather than understanding what matters to you." Violet blinked in surprise at this admission and at the mention of Jackson. Had her suitors been discussing their courtship strategies? "That's perceptive of Mr. Keller," she managed. Thomas nodded, still holding her hand. "He suggested I ask about your dreams for the bookshop and your writing. So I'm asking now, what do you want, Violet? For your business, for your future?" The question was so similar to what James had asked her, yet it felt different coming from Thomas. There was sincerity in his inquiry, but also a sense that he was following advice rather than being genuinely curious. Nevertheless, Violet appreciated the effort. "I want to expand the bookshop's offerings," she said carefully. "Perhaps add a section for educational materials that the school could use. And yes, I hope to write stories about the West someday, the real West, not the romanticized version in dime novels." Thomas listened attentively, nodding. "Those are admirable goals," he said as the carriage stopped before the bookshop. "Perhaps, as Mrs. Reed, you could establish a proper library for Snake River. With my family's resources behind you, you could order books from anywhere in the country." And there it was the assumption that her dreams would be subsumed into his family's plans, that her independence would be exchanged for the Reed name and fortune. Before she could formulate a response, Thomas leaned forward and kissed her cheek, the gesture brief but unmistakably proprietary. "Think about it," he said softly. "We could do great things together, Violet." As she climbed the stairs to her quarters that evening, Violet's mind was in turmoil. The Reed family offered security, social position, and the means to accomplish certain goals, yet at what cost to her independence? And how did these considerations weigh against her growing feelings for James Keating, a man who had fewer material advantages to offer, but who seemed to truly see her as an equal? Monday passed in a blur of customers and preparations for James's breeding records project. Violet created a systematic approach to organizing the information, designing templates for recording lineage, characteristics, and outcomes. The work absorbed her completely, providing a welcome distraction from thoughts of Sunday's dinner and the approaching visit to James's ranch. By Tuesday morning, Violet was both excited and nervous about the day ahead. She opened the shop briefly to post a notice that she would be closed for inventory, then changed into her sturdiest dress, a practical brown cotton that would withstand the dust of travel and the potential hazards of a working ranch. At precisely 10 o'clock, a wagon pulled up outside the bookshop. The driver was a middle-aged Hispanic man with a weather-beaten face and kind eyes. He removed his hat as Violet approached. "Miss Evans, I am Miguel Ortiz, Senor Keating's foreman. He asked me to bring you to the ranch today." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Ortiz," Violet replied, climbing onto the wagon seat beside him. "I've been looking forward to seeing the ranch." Miguel smiled, replacing his hat. "Senor James said you have interest in the horses. It is good. The animals, they know who appreciates them." As they left the town behind, Miguel proved to be an informative guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the early days of Snake River. Violet learned that he had worked for James since the ranch's beginning, coming north from Texas after the war. "Senor James, he is a good man," Miguel said as they forded a shallow section of the river. "Fair with his workers, gentle with the horses. Some men, they use force to break a horse's spirit. Senor James, he uses patience." Violet found herself storing away these details, both for her understanding of James and as potential material for her writing. "How did you come to work for him?" she asked. Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "After the war, many Tejanos Mexican Texans, we were not welcome in our homes anymore. I was traveling north looking for work. In Denver, I met Senor James. He had just married then, full of dreams for a horse ranch." His eyes grew sad. "After the tragedy with his wife and baby, I thought he would give up, but he is strong, that one. Said we would start again in Wyoming." The mention of James's deceased wife reminded Violet of how little she knew about his past. She had avoided asking too many questions, sensing his reluctance to discuss painful memories. But now, heading toward the place he had built after such loss, she wished she understood more about the experiences that had shaped him. "Here we are," Miguel announced as they crested a hill, gesturing to the valley below. "Keating Ranch." Violet's first impression was of careful planning and hard work, rather than the ostentatious display of wealth she had seen at Riverfront. The main house was modest but well built, a single-story structure of logs and stone with a wide porch across the front. Surrounding it were several sturdy outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, storage sheds, and what appeared to be a workshop. Beyond these spread fenced pastures where horses grazed in small groups, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. Unlike the Reed Ranch with its dozens of workers and constant activity, Keating Ranch had a peaceful, ordered atmosphere. Violet could see only a few men working, one repairing a fence, another exercising a horse in a round corral, a third carrying supplies between buildings. "It's lovely," she said sincerely as Miguel guided the wagon toward the house. "So different from what I expected." "Different from the big cattle ranches, yes," Miguel agreed. "Senor James says quality matters more than quantity with horses." He pulled the wagon to a stop before the house. "Come. First I show you inside, then the horses." The interior of James's home reflected the same principles as the exterior, simple but well-crafted, with an emphasis on comfort rather than display. The main room combined a sitting area and dining space, with a stone fireplace as its focal point. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that made Violet smile in recognition: history, poetry, practical guides to horse breeding, and several novels she had recommended to him from her shop. Most surprising was the collection of framed sketches hanging on the walls, detailed studies of horses in various poses, captured with remarkable skill and sensitivity. "Did James commission these?" she asked Miguel, studying a particularly lifelike drawing of a mare and foal. The foreman chuckled. "No, señorita. Señor James made these himself. He draws when the work is done, especially in winter when the days are short." Violet stared at the sketches with new appreciation. James had never mentioned this talent during their conversations about art and literature. Yet more evidence, she thought, of the depths beneath his quiet exterior. After showing her the rest of the house, a small kitchen, a study lined with more books and papers, and a glimpse of a simply furnished bedroom, Miguel led her outside to meet the horses that were the heart of the ranch. The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions to the equine residents of Keating Ranch. Each horse had a name, a personality, and a story that Miguel related with obvious affection. Violet learned to distinguish between the distinctive bloodlines. James was developing the sturdy, intelligent mares from Spanish stock, the powerful stallions with Kentucky racing heritage, and the promising young colts and fillies that combined the best traits of both. "This is Estrella, Thunderbolt's mother," Miguel said as they approached a beautiful dark bay mare in a paddock near the barn. "Señor James's favorite. Very smart, this one. Knows what you want before you ask." The mare approached the fence curiously, extending her neck to sniff Violet's outstretched hand, just as James had taught her with Thunderbolt. After a moment's consideration, Estrella allowed Violet to stroke her sleek neck. "She likes you," Miguel observed with approval. "Has good judgment, this mare." By midday, Violet's head was spinning with information about bloodlines, training methods, and horse behavior. Her initial nervousness around the large animals had given way to genuine fascination, especially after Miguel allowed her to help groom a particularly gentle mare named Duchess. "Time for lunch," Miguel announced as the sun reached its zenith. "Señora Ortiz has prepared something special for our guest." They returned to the house, where Miguel's wife, Elena, had laid out a feast of traditional Mexican dishes: enchiladas filled with tender beef, beans seasoned with chilies, and fresh tortillas still warm from the griddle. "This is delicious," Violet exclaimed after her first bite. "I've never tasted anything like it." Elena, a plump woman with a ready smile, beamed at the compliment. "It is my pleasure to cook for someone who appreciates good food. Señor James, he enjoys my cooking, but men do not express such things properly." As they ate, Violet asked more questions about the ranch's operations: how many horses they typically bred each year, how James selected which animals to keep for breeding and which to sell, and how he had developed his reputation among buyers. "He is becoming known," Miguel said proudly. "The army officers, they come now to see his horses. Ranchers from Montana, they write letters asking about his stallions. Even a man from California who raises racehorses, he visited last month." "James mentioned he keeps detailed records of his breeding program," Violet said, pulling out the notes and templates she had prepared. "I've been working on a system to organize the information more effectively." Miguel studied the papers with interest. "This is very good. Señor James, he knows each horse perfectly in his mind, but on paper." He made a rueful face. "Not so organized." After lunch, Miguel showed Violet the training methods James used with the young horses: gentle but firm techniques that built trust between horse and handler, rather than breaking the animal's spirit through force. Many horse trainers, They think the horse must fear the human to obey, Miguel explained as they watched a young ranch hand working with a yearling colt in the round corral. Senor James says no, the horse must respect the human, yes, but also trust. It takes longer this way, but makes a better horse in the end. Violet thought about the parallels between this philosophy and the way James had approached their acquaintance with patience and respect, rather than the forceful pursuit his competitors had employed. The insight gave her a deeper appreciation for his character. As the afternoon waned, Miguel suggested they walk to the ridge behind the house, where a view of the entire valley could be seen. The climb was gentle but steady, and Violet was grateful for her practical shoes as they made their way up the grassy slope. At the top, she gasped at the vista spread before them. The ranch buildings below looked like toys, the pastures forming a patchwork of greens and browns, and the Snake River a silver ribbon winding through it all. In the distance, the mountains rose in purple majesty against the sky, their peaks still tipped with snow even in late spring. "Senor James comes here often," Miguel said quietly, standing beside her. "To think, to draw sometimes. He says a man needs perspective." He glanced at Violet. "He asked me to bring you here to show you his favorite place." Touched by this intimate glimpse into James's private world, Violet stood in silence, trying to see the landscape through his eyes. After the losses he had endured, had this view helped him find peace? Had standing on this ridge, watching the changing seasons, given him hope to begin again? "Thank you for bringing me here," she said finally. "For showing me everything." Miguel nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Senor James, he is private man, does not show his heart easily, but I have worked for him many years. I see things." He fixed Violet with a direct gaze. "He has not brought anyone to the ranch since his wife. Not until you." The significance of this statement settled over Violet like a mantle. James hadn't merely invited her to see his horses. He had opened his home, his work, his passion to her inspection. Through Miguel, he had shared parts of himself he perhaps couldn't express directly. As they made their way back down the ridge toward the waiting wagon, Violet's mind was filled with impressions of the day, the peaceful order of the ranch, the evident respect of the workers for their employer, the careful attention to the horse's welfare, and most of all, the sense of purpose that infused everything James had built. This was a man who had faced tragedy and chosen to create rather than surrender, who valued substance over appearance, who treated those around him, human and animal alike, with consistent respect. In the space of a single day, Violet's understanding of James Keating had deepened immeasurably. The journey back to Snake River was quieter, both Violet and Miguel lost in their thoughts as the wagon rolled through the gathering dusk. When they reached the bookshop, Miguel helped her down from the seat with old-world courtesy. "Senor James returns in 4 days," he said as she gathered her belongings. "He asked me to tell you he hopes you found the visit worthwhile." "More than worthwhile," Violet replied honestly. "Please thank him for his hospitality when you write to him. And thank you, Mr. Ortiz, for being such an excellent guide." Miguel tipped his hat. "It was my pleasure, Miss Evans. Perhaps you will visit again someday." There was a hint of hopeful meaning in his tone that made Violet blush slightly. "Perhaps I will," she agreed, then added impulsively, "Mr. Ortiz, would you tell James Mr. Keating that I've started a story about a horse ranch? His ranch has provided inspiration." Miguel's face creased in a broad smile. "I will tell him, señorita. He will be very pleased, I think." As the wagon pulled away, Violet stood on the boardwalk, watching until it disappeared into the gathering darkness. The day had left her with much to consider, and a growing certainty about where her heart truly lay. What she didn't notice, in her preoccupation, was the figure of Thomas Reid watching from across the street, his expression darkening as he observed her return from an all-day absence in the company of James Keating's foreman. The next morning, Violet awoke to the sound of raised voices in the street below her window. Wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, she peered outside to see a small crowd gathering in front of the general store next to her shop. At the center of the commotion stood Thomas Reid, his face flushed with anger as he confronted Jackson Keller. "You had no right to interfere," Thomas shouted, his usual polish abandoned in his rage. "My relationship with Miss Evans is none of your concern." Jackson's stance was defensive but controlled. "I didn't interfere, Reid. I simply suggested you might try actually talking to the lady about her interests instead of parading your family's wealth." Several onlookers murmured in agreement, which seemed to further inflame Thomas. "And then you went running to Keating with the same advice, didn't you? Trying to give yourself an advantage by helping him." Violet's breath caught. Were they arguing about her? And what did Thomas mean about Jackson helping James? "That's ridiculous," Jackson replied, though Violet thought she detected a flicker of guilt in his expression. "Keating makes his own decisions." "Then how do you explain Miss Evans spending the entire day at his ranch yesterday?" Thomas demanded. "Convenient timing, with him away in Cheyenne, and you suddenly so interested in helping your competitors." Violet pulled away from the window, mortified. News of her visit to Keating Ranch had clearly spread through town overnight, and now Thomas was publicly challenging Jackson about it. She dressed hurriedly, knowing she needed to intervene before the situation escalated further. By the time she reached the street, Samuel Wilson had appeared in his capacity as deputy, physically separating the two men while trying to disperse the growing crowd of spectators. "That's enough, gentlemen," Samuel said firmly. "Take your disagreement elsewhere before I have to officially step in." Violet pushed through the onlookers, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, facing both men. "How dare you cause a public scene over my personal decisions?" Thomas turned to her, his anger giving way to a look of wounded pride. "Violet, I thought after Sunday's dinner after meeting my parents that we had an understanding. Then I learned you spent yesterday at Keating's ranch." "We have no understanding, Mr. Reid," Violet replied coldly. "I accepted a dinner invitation, nothing more. And yes, I visited Mr. Keating's ranch to see his horses and gather material for my writing. I don't require permission for my activities." Jackson stepped forward, his expression apologetic. "Miss Evans is right. This display is beneath both of us." He gave Thomas a pointed look. "The lady is free to make her own choices." "This isn't over, Keller," Thomas muttered, but he backed down, straightening his vest and nodding stiffly to Violet. "My apologies for the disturbance, Miss Evans. I spoke out of concern for your reputation." With as much dignity as she could muster, Violet addressed the lingering crowd. "There is nothing to see here, folks. Please go about your business." She then turned on her heel and marched back to her bookshop, anger and humiliation burning in her chest. She had barely unlocked the door when Jackson caught up to her. "Miss Evans, I truly apologize for that scene. It wasn't my intention to cause you embarrassment." Violet faced him, her anger still simmering. "Is it true what Thomas said? Have you been giving advice to both him and James about how to pursue me?" The thought of being discussed by the men like a strategy in a card game made her stomach turn. Jackson had the grace to look ashamed. "Not exactly," he said. "Reid asked me why you seemed to prefer Keating's company, and I suggested he might try showing interest in your writing and the bookshop instead of just impressing you with his family's standing." He hesitated, then admitted, "And yes, I may have mentioned to Keating that you appreciated his questions about your dreams, But that was before, he broke off. Before what? Violet pressed. Jackson met her gaze directly. Before I realized that he doesn't need my advice. That perhaps what you see in him is something the rest of us have been too blind or arrogant to offer. The candor of his admission surprised her. And what might that be, Mr. Keller? Respect, Jackson said simply. Not just the kind that makes a man tip his hat or open a door, but the deeper sort that recognizes a woman's mind as equal to his own. He shook his head ruefully. It's a humbling revelation. Violet's anger softened at his unexpected insight. Thank you for your honesty, she said more gently. But please understand that I won't be the subject of wagers, competitions, or public confrontations. My choices are my own. You're right, of course, Jackson agreed. And for what it's worth, I think Keating is a lucky man. Before Violet could respond that she had made no definitive choice, Jackson tipped his hat and departed, leaving her to wonder at the strange turn events had taken. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of activity as Violet threw herself into her work. She completed the organizational system for James's breeding records, continued her own writing in the evenings, and maintained a polite but distant demeanor with the townspeople who came into the shop, clearly hoping for gossip about the courtship competition. Thomas Reed did not return to the bookshop, though he sent a formal note of apology for his behavior, accompanied by yet another expensive gift, this time a silver pen and inkwell set, which Violet promptly returned with a polite but firm note explaining that she could not accept such valuable items. Samuel Wilson continued his daily visits to the shop, but seemed to have accepted that Violet's interests lay elsewhere, contenting himself with friendly conversations about books and town news, rather than pursuing a romantic connection. Jackson, true to his word, maintained a respectful distance, greeting her cordially when they met on the street, but making no further attempts at courtship. Through it all, Violet found her thoughts returning constantly to James, to the quiet strength she had sensed in his home, to the passion evident in his work with the horses, to the way he alone among her suitors had asked about her dreams rather than assuming she would adapt to his. By Saturday, nearly a week after her visit to the ranch, Violet was anxiously watching the street for any sign of James's return from Cheyenne. Miguel had mentioned 4 days, but travel in the territory could be unpredictable, dependent on weather and road conditions. The bell above the shop door jingled late in the afternoon, and Violet looked up eagerly from her counter only to find Clara Matthews entering instead of James. "You look disappointed to see me," Clara observed with amusement. "Expecting someone else?" Violet smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to everyone with eyes," Clara replied, echoing her comment from the dance. "The entire town is talking about your visit to Keating's ranch and the subsequent showdown between Reed and Keller. Mrs. Hollister has closed her betting book and declared you and James the winners." She studied Violet's face. "Though from your expression, I gather the gentleman himself hasn't yet returned from Cheyenne to claim his prize." "He's not claiming anything," Violet protested, though her blush betrayed her. "And I wish people would stop treating my personal life as public entertainment." Clara perched on a stool by the counter. "Welcome to small-town living, my dear. In the absence of theaters and concert halls, local romances provide the best entertainment available." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Though I must say, you've managed to create quite the dramatic final act. The proud rancher's son humbled, the charming cowboy gracefully conceding, and the quiet horseman winning the lady's heart by simply asking what she wants from life. It's better than a dime novel." Despite her embarrassment, Violet couldn't help laughing. "You make it sound so theatrical." "Because it is," Clara insisted. Do you know how rare it is for a woman in these parts to have actual choices? Most arrive already married or become engaged within weeks out of practical necessity. You've had the luxury of considering 3 no, 4 counting the blacksmith's son eligible men, all desperately trying to win your favor. It's unprecedented. Violet sobered at this reminder of the unusual freedom her uncle's legacy had provided her. I suppose that's true, she acknowledged, though I never set out to create a competition. Of course not, Clara said kindly. But you've handled it with grace, and dare I say, you've taught the gentleman of Snake River a valuable lesson about what truly matters in courtship. She reached across the counter to squeeze Violet's hand. Now tell me honestly, has Keating declared himself? Are you spoken for? No, Violet admitted. Nothing has been formally discussed. We've simply connected through books and conversations and shared interests. And through him asking about your dreams, Clara added pointedly. Don't underestimate the power of that simple question, Violet. In a world where women are expected to subsume their ambitions to their husband's plans, a man who genuinely wants to know your aspirations is rare indeed. Before Violet could respond, the bell jingled again. This time, when she looked up, her heart leaped into her throat. James Keating stood in the doorway, travel-worn and dusty but unmistakably present. "Miss Evans," he said, his deep voice sending a flutter through her chest. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Clara rose from her stool with a knowing smile. "Not at all, Mr. Keating. I was just leaving." She winked at Violet as she passed James. "Welcome back to Snake River. I believe you've been missed." When they were alone, James approached the counter, his expression a mixture of weariness and hope. "Miguel told me you visited the ranch," he said without preamble. "That you spent time with the horses and saw the view from the ridge." Violet nodded, suddenly shy in his presence after the week of anticipation. "It was a wonderful day. Your home is beautiful and the horses are magnificent. And did you find inspiration for your writing as you hoped?" "More than I expected," she admitted. "I've started a story about a woman who discovers a new world through horses, their strength and intelligence, their honesty." She hesitated, then added, "and about the man who shows her this world, who builds something meaningful after loss." Understanding dawned in James's eyes. "Miguel told you about my past." "Only what helped me understand the ranch and your work," Violet assured him. "I hope you don't mind." James shook his head slowly. "I don't mind. In fact, He trailed off, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I hear there was some trouble while I was away, between Reed and Keller." Violet sighed. "Nothing serious, though embarrassing. They seem to have decided I'm worth fighting over, though Mr. Keller has since shown remarkable insight and grace about the situation." "And Reed?" "Less grace, more wounded pride," she replied honestly. "But it's settled now, I think." James was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on her face. "And what about you, Violet? Has anything settled for you during my absence?" The directness of the question made her breath catch. This was at the moment to be as honest with him as he had always been with her. "Yes," she said softly. "I've realized that among all the men competing for my attention, only one has truly seen me not as a potential wife or a prize to be won, but as a person with my own dreams and ambitions." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "Only one has asked what I want from life, rather than telling me how I would fit into his plans." James took a step closer, hope kindling in his eyes. "And what do you want, Violet Evans? Not just for your writing or the bookshop, but for yourself." Violet came out from behind the counter to stand before him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the lines at their corners that spoke of both hardship and laughter. "I want a partnership, not just a marriage," she said with quiet certainty. I want to build something meaningful alongside someone who respects my mind as well as my heart. I want the freedom to pursue my writing while sharing in the work that matters to him." She took a deep breath. "I want what I felt at your ranch, James, that sense of purpose and peace, of belonging to something larger than myself." James reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused ones. "I came to Snake River seeking solitude," he said, his voice low and intense. "After losing Sarah and our son, I didn't want connections, didn't want to risk that pain again. The horses were enough." He squeezed her hands. "Then you arrived with your books and your questions and your dreams, and suddenly solitude wasn't enough anymore." Violet's heart pounded as he continued, his words careful and measured as always, yet filled with emotion. "I can't offer you what Reed can, no fine house in town, no political ambitions, no imported luxuries. My life is simpler. The work is hard sometimes, the winter's long." His eyes held hers. "But I can promise you this. Your dreams will always matter to me. Your writing will have space to grow, and if you choose to share my life, it would be a true partnership." "James," Violet whispered, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I love you, Violet," he said simply. "Not for what you might become as my wife, but for who you already are. The woman who brings books to a frontier town, who writes stories others haven't thought to tell, who saw past my solitude to the man beneath." Tears welled in Violet's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling both momentous and natural, as if she had been waiting her whole life to say them to this man. "And I choose you not because you won some competition, but because you never treated me as a prize to be won in the first place." James released her hands, but only to frame her face gently between his palms. "May I kiss you, Violet Evans?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, she rose on tiptoe, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender yet passionate, a promise of the partnership they had both spoken of, equal in giving and receiving, in strength and vulnerability. When they finally drew apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak to Reverend Walsh," he murmured. "Make this official." Violet smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. "Yes," she agreed. "But first, tell me about Cheyenne. Did the governor's son like Thunderbolt?" James laughed, the sound warm and rich. "He did, and he asked if I had other horses of similar quality. It seems I may have more business coming from the territorial capital." "That's wonderful," Violet said sincerely. "Perhaps my organizational system for your breeding records will be useful sooner than expected." "Speaking of which," James said, reaching into his coat, "I brought you something from Cheyenne." He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A token of appreciation for your help with my records." Violet unwrapped it to find a beautiful fountain pen, elegant but practical, with her initials engraved on its barrel. Unlike Thomas's ostentatious silver pen set, this was a writer's tool meant for use, not display. "It's perfect," she said, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you," James smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I thought you might need it for those stories you're going to write, including the one about the horse ranch." As the afternoon light slanted through the bookshop windows, turning the dust motes to gold, Violet realized that the story of the horse ranch was just beginning, and that she would be both its author and one of its central characters. The thought filled her with a joy she had never imagined finding in the small frontier town of Snake River, Wyoming. 1 year later, Violet stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as James worked with a spirited young filly in the round corral. The morning sun gilded his dark hair, now streaked with more silver than when they had first met, and highlighted the strength in his shoulders as he moved with the horse, guiding rather than forcing. suggesting rather than demanding. So much had changed in 12 months, yet the core of what had drawn them together remained constant: their mutual respect, their shared love of books and ideas, and their commitment to building something meaningful together. Their wedding had been a simple affair at the small church in Snake River, with Clara as Violet's attendant and, surprisingly, Jackson Keller standing as James's best man. The two men had developed an unlikely friendship in the months following Violet's choice, bonded by their shared interest in horses, and perhaps by the humbling experience of learning what truly mattered to the woman they had both pursued. Thomas Reed had left town shortly after the engagement announcement, taking a position with a banking firm in Cheyenne. Rumors suggested he was courting the daughter of a territorial judge, his political ambitions still very much alive. Samuel Wilson remained Snake River's reliable deputy, eventually finding happiness with the new schoolteacher who arrived to replace Clara when she accepted a position at a ladies' college back east. As for Violet, she had found a balance that suited her perfectly. 3 days a week, she still operated the bookshop in town, having hired a local girl to assist her with the daily operations. The other days were spent at the ranch, where she had established a small office in what had once been James's study, now their shared workspace, with his breeding records and sketches mingling with her manuscripts and notes. Her first collection of short stories about life in the West had been accepted by a publisher in Chicago, with publication scheduled for the following spring. James had been her first and most attentive reader, offering insights from his years on the frontier, without ever attempting to override her unique perspective as a woman chronicling a world traditionally described by men. The filly in the corral finally relaxed, lowering her head in acceptance of James's gentle guidance. He stroked her neck, murmuring words of praise that Violet couldn't hear from the porch, but could imagine from the many times she had watched him work. As if sensing her attention, James looked up, his face breaking into a smile that still made her heart skip. He said something to Miguel, who had been watching from the fence, then made his way toward the house, removing his gloves as he walked. "How's the writing coming?" he asked as he climbed the porch steps, leaning down to kiss her in greeting no longer the careful, restrained man who had asked permission for their first kiss, but a husband secure in his welcome. "The third story is nearly finished," Violet replied, making room for him on the porch swing beside her. "The one about the cattle drive." James settled beside her, his arm naturally finding its place around her shoulders. "Based on Jackson's adventures in Texas." Violet nodded, leaning into his embrace. "He has a gift for storytelling, though I had to tone down some of his more colorful anecdotes for publication." James chuckled. "I imagine so." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains visible in the distance. "I've been thinking about expanding the breeding program," he said. "The Army contract is secure, and that Denver businessman wants 6 more horses next spring." "That's wonderful," Violet said, genuinely pleased by his success. James's careful breeding approach was gaining recognition beyond Wyoming territory, with buyers willing to pay premium prices for his well-trained, intelligent horses. "It would mean building another stable," he continued, "perhaps hiring another hand or two." He looked down at her, his expression growing more serious. "I wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable with the changes. This is your home too, your dream alongside mine." The simple statement encapsulated everything she loved about their marriage: the way he consistently included her in decisions, respecting her opinion not just in womanly matters but in all aspects of their shared life. "I think it's an excellent idea," she said, squeezing his hand. The demand for your horses is growing and we have the land for expansion." She hesitated, then added with a smile, "Besides, we might need the additional income soon." James looked at her quizzically, not immediately understanding her meaning. The book advance seemed quite generous. Violet took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "I wasn't thinking of the book," she said softly. Comprehension dawned in his eyes, followed by a mixture of joy and momentary fear, the shadow of his past loss briefly crossing his face before hope overcame it. "Violet," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you certain?" She nodded, her own eyes filling with tears of happiness. "Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a baby in the early spring." James gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass while burying his face in her hair. When he finally drew back, there were tears on his cheeks, but his smile was radiant. "I never thought I'd have this chance again," he admitted. "After Sarah and the baby died, I closed that door in my heart." "I know," Violet said gently, touching his face. "Are you happy about reopening it?" "Terrified and overjoyed in equal measure," he answered honestly. "But with you, Violet, with us together, I believe we can face whatever comes." He placed his hand again on her stomach, wonder in his expression. "A child, our child." They sat together on the porch swing for a long time, making plans and sharing dreams for their growing family. James wanted to add a room to the house for a nursery, with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Violet spoke of the children's books she would read aloud, the stories she would tell of both their families' histories. "Boy or girl, this child will know how to ride before walking," James declared with mock seriousness, though his eyes twinkled. "A Keating tradition." "And will know their letters before school age," Violet countered. "An Evans tradition." James laughed, pulling her closer. "A perfect blend of both our dreams," he said, and kissed her again, a promise for their future sealed with tenderness. As twilight gathered over the ranch, they remained on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Miguel lit the lanterns in the barn, their golden glow creating pools of light in the gathering dusk. From the bunkhouse came the sound of a guitar and men's voices singing an old Spanish ballad. "Are you happy here, Violet?" James asked softly. "With this life we've built?" Violet looked up at him, at the face that had become dearer to her than any other. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. "I came west seeking independence, but I found something better, a true partnership with a man who sees me completely." James smiled, the expression transforming his serious face in the way that still made her breath catch. "All because I asked about your dreams," he mused. "And listen to the answer," Violet added, resting her head on his shoulder as night fully claimed the Wyoming sky. In the years that followed, as their family grew with the addition of a son, they named William, after James's father, and later a daughter they called Alina, after Violet's mother. The Keating ranch prospered and expanded. Violet's stories of the West found an eager audience back east, bringing her a modest literary fame that she accepted with characteristic grace. Their children grew up surrounded by books and horses, equally at home in the saddle or curled up with a volume of poetry. William inherited his father's gift with animals and his mother's storytelling ability, while Alina showed an early talent for drawing like her father and a determination that matched her mother's. Thomas Reed eventually became a state senator when Wyoming achieved statehood, occasionally visiting Snake River with his wife and children. The old rivalry faded into a cautious mutual respect, particularly after James's breeding program gained national recognition, proving that success could come without inherited wealth or family connections. Jackson Keller remained a good friend to both James and Violet, eventually marrying a widow who moved to town with her young son. He continued working as foreman at the Reed Ranch, though he purchased his own small spread near the Keatings, where he raised a few horses of his own, often seeking James's advice on bloodlines and training. Through all the changes and challenges of frontier life, through harsh winters and summer droughts, through childbirth and childhood illnesses, economic ups and downs, and the gradual transformation of the territory into a state, James and Violet's partnership remained strong, founded on that first, crucial question about dreams, and built through daily choices to respect and support each other's aspirations. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James presented Violet with a specially bound collection of all her published stories, along with a new journal for those yet to be written. Inside the cover, he had inscribed a simple message: "To my wife, whose dreams made room for mine. With love and gratitude for the story we write together each day." And Violet, who had once feared that marriage would mean surrendering her independence, discovered that the right partnership had instead expanded her world beyond anything she could have imagined when she first arrived in Snake River, a young woman alone, unaware that among the cowboys competing for her attention, she would choose the one who asked about her dreams, and in doing so, find her heart's true home.